Hey guys, I'm back with round 8 from my recent tournament, the Bay Area International. In this round, I was paired with FIDE master Aaron Jacobson, who's definitely quite a strong player. And he actually surprised me on move 1 with 1d4. He normally is a e4 player, at least as far as I can remember from his database. So when he played d4, I was definitely a little bit surprised by this. So I figured he likely prepared something against my main opening, the King's Indian defense, and normally I don't mind playing against preparation because I kind of believe in my lines and I feel like I'm well prepped and I understand the positions well, so even if he prepares something I should be able to handle it. But in any case, I figured since he is not a regular d4 player, I should try to trick him with a move like d6. Although I had a very specific idea in mind here, because I figured he quite likely will transpose back into e4 because he's normally an e4 player, and after e4 we're getting a perk defense, and that's what ended up happening, which I was fine with because I had kind of prepared something interesting to play here as well. Had he done something else like knight f3 or c4, then I would have maybe continued improvising with g6 or something like that. I'm not really sure. I would have decided at the board. Although c4, maybe I would have just played e5 here because this endgame is considered quite playable for black as far as these endgames go. Black just plays c6, puts the king on c7, and eventually uses the c5 square for the pieces, and I feel like black's position is very healthy and totally playable. Well, okay, he played e4 and I went for this line with knight c6. So this has become rather popular, at least in the last year or so. Magnus played it a couple times, and there are other strong players who have been using this move, and I think it's quite interesting. I played it a couple times before. I think I've had one draw and one loss with it, but I think the positions are rather interesting, and I felt like it was definitely a good choice for this game because I, of course, wanted to keep playing for a win. Knight c3, knight f6, and here white played f4, which is very aggressive. I don't think he knew the line because he was already spending quite a bit of time here before trotting out f4. So I felt like probably he was just feeling like this is probably a critical move and wanted to play it. The main point of this line is that we are developing the knight to c6 quite early, and we're kind of tempting white to push d5. If white continues with knight f3, black will play g6, and if white keeps playing normal moves, let's say bishop g7, castles, castles, here it's kind of the moment of truth, because if white doesn't play h3 here, black will likely play bishop g4, and if white doesn't play d5 at some moment, black will, I think, is already ready to just play e5 and fight for the center. So after some move like bishop e3, I imagine either bishop g4 or e5 here, and black is already doing fine. So in order for white to play for an advantage here, they should typically try and seize some space with d5. Black's idea is to go back to b8. Let's say white plays h3 here, just to keep the bishop from coming to g4. And then black typically plays a move like c6 here and then tries to chip away at white's center. The knight usually goes to d7, queen c7, pawn a5, and eventually black can even play like rook e8 and e6. So it's a very, I think, playable type of position. I mean, no doubt white is probably getting some advantage here. It's definitely a risky line for black to play. But all of black's moves are kind of natural, and what we've done is we've kind of turned the game into a King's Indian, which I'm definitely happy with. And I feel like this is a good choice against a lot of e4 players if they're not familiar of playing this type of position where they have more space and they're playing against the bishop on g7. Even with an advantage, these positions aren't easy to play. So that's kind of my idea behind playing this line, but f4 was definitely a surprise, and now we were kind of both most likely on our own here. I was pretty sure the move was e5 here, but I stopped to think because I wasn't 100% sure, and so I felt like I should just start thinking right from here and make sure all my moves are sound. But okay, eventually e5 looked good enough to play. White pushed d5, which I think is definitely very tempting move and probably the best move. And I played knight to d4. I probably should have put the knight on e7, and then after something like takes on e5, knight f3, knight g6, I think black is more or less okay here. Bishop b5 check can be met with bishop d7, And I'm ready to just develop my dark square bishop and castle, and I think the position is quite reasonable. White can also not take on e5, just play like knight f3 here, and then I think black is supposed to take on f4, play knight g6, and then bishop goes to e7, castles, and well, black tries to use this e5 square in the future, and I think has a reasonable position. Okay, so now we know. In the game, I felt like knight d4 is kind of aggressive and seemed reasonable, so I went for it. White played knight f3, which was a little bit surprising. I was definitely expecting the move bishop e3 here, which I think is the most critical option. Then I was planning on playing c5, and if d takes c6, knight takes c6. And this actually transposes to a position from the Sicilian after the move knight f3. I had no idea during the game, but yeah, apparently this is like a known line in the Sicilian where white is probably better here. I think the key line is knight g4, queen d2, knight takes e3, queen takes e3, and then white castles queenside, bishop c4, and gets a pretty decent game here. So yeah, I feel like bishop e3 is probably the best move for white at this point. But okay, he played knight f3, I played bishop g4, just trying to develop consistently bishop e3, and now it's time to take on f3, g takes f3. I threw an e takes f4, because white is kind of obliged to recapture, and then I pulled my bishop back to d7. So during the game, I wasn't really sure about the evaluation in this position. I felt like black is probably okay, although white should be somewhat better. My plan is to just play g6, bishop g7, castle, eventually play knight h5, actually play knight h5 very soon, and yeah, maybe even push f5 in the future. So I think this is a reasonable plan, and white kind of starts drifting here, as we'll see. He starts rerouting his bishop too many times. Had he played aggressive move bishop g5, I think white is definitely getting some edge here. Because now if I play g6, let's say queen d2, bishop g7, castles queenside, castles kingside, I was analyzing this position a little bit. I think after h4, white is definitely getting some very real attacking chances. He would love to play h5 if allowed, so black should probably make this move themselves. But then after something like rook g1, and then I think bishop coming to d3, it feels very, very shaky for black's kingside eventually. You never know, like some e5 might rip open the position, followed by de5, knight e4, and just a lot of pressure against black's kingside. Of course, bishop h6 is definitely a big idea here too. But okay, let's just get back to the game. White played queen to d2. I threw a knight h5, and then bishop g3. So yeah, this was played after, I think, quite some time, quite some thought. I don't really love the idea. I mean, black could take on g3 and grab the two bishops, and I feel like with the dark squared bishop, this is always a reasonable thing to do. But white's position certainly makes sense here. I mean, he can castle queenside, and he has this like open h file to use. So this would be, you know, really dangerous for black to go into. But the real issue is that I'm not really obliged to take, and so I just continue with my plan with g6, and white's bishop on g3 doesn't really make a lot of sense, because now I can't push h4. White is not pushing e5 in the position, so it's, yeah, kind of unclear what white's best plan here is with the bishop on g3. So instead of bishop g3, I think bishop g5 was probably a better move. Bishop e7, and then maybe even rook g1. And I think if we trade these dark squared bishops, it should be in black's favor, because white has long-term these like weak pawns on f3 and h2, and my idea here is maybe even just to play like g6, eventually castle, try to trade pieces, even trade queens, and play that endgame where long-term I can play against those pawns, eventually play f5 and target some of white's weaknesses. So I wasn't sure here. The computer seems to think that white has a slight advantage, but to me it felt like a very playable position from black's point of view. But okay, so yeah, bishop g3 was a little bit surprising. I pushed g6, white castled, and bishop g7. So here my opponent spent more time and ended up playing bishop f2. Kind of just admitting, yeah, that his idea with bishop g3, it makes sense if I take the bishop, but if I don't take, then the bishop is just kind of sitting there and isn't helping white's position. So I castled, and then I was very surprised by his next move, bishop e3. Because now the bishop has just made a complete circle, going to g3, f2, and now e3, where after I played knight h5 on move 10, of course the bishop could have just gone here right away. So white is essentially just having given up, like, I guess, 2 whole moves with this maneuver. So during the game, I mean, I felt amazingly comfortable here with black. I felt like if my position was kind of somewhat okay before, then now it must be totally fine, if not better. So it turns out I probably could have just played f5 right away, and the position is very interesting because it seems like we have king's castle on opposite sides of the board, but neither side is really getting such a dangerous attack. From black's point of view, I have this nice diagonal, but I don't have any open lines on the queen side. I was definitely considering moves like c6 and b5 here, but I wasn't really loving everything in those lines. Instead, I think black is very justified just to play kind of more positionally, inviting white to take on f5 and then taking with the bishop and eventually just playing against these weaknesses. And I think black is very happy here. So of course white probably wouldn't take on f5, but it seems like black is already doing extremely well. I chose to move queen e7. I felt like this was just a little bit more flexible. White played bishop g2, and I decided to play f5 at this moment. I guess I could have waited a little bit to see if he really wanted to play f4 or not, because I figured this was his idea with putting the bishop on g2. And with that in mind, maybe I should have just played rook e8, because if white plays f4, then I think f5 just comes with kind of stronger effect, because now the e4 pawn is under attack, and I might be threatening just to take on c3 and then take the pawn and just play a position with the pawn up, because I'm not too worried about my dark squares there. I think my knight can come back to g7 into f5 and kind of cover everything. But okay, I think f5 as played in the game is probably good enough. So now bishop g5 is played. I step to the side, bishop h3. I added some pressure with rook e8, and white played king b1. I think this is maybe a mistake. He really should have played a move like rook f1 here, so that if black takes on e4, he can at least recapture and open up his rook, and that's pretty uncomfortable for me to meet, with my queen having very few squares, and I might have to just kind of self-pin myself, which would not be good. So of course I wouldn't take on e4 here. I would probably play something like b5. And yeah, I definitely still love black's position. I want to play b4, then maybe bring the rook back to the b file or push c6 or something, and just try to open up the queen side and deliver mate. But I do think that was at least white's best chance at this moment, because now I feel like after king b1, black is getting a big advantage. So I finally take on e4, and because bishop on h3 is hanging, he has to take on d7, queen takes d7, f takes c4, and I came in with rook f3. Now I'm potentially threatening to just play bishop takes c3 and just double white's pawns and weaken the king. I also want to take the e4 pawn, so he's really under a lot of pressure here. I was really hoping for this move, rook f1, because then bishop takes c3 would not only double his pawns, but it would just outright win a rook, which would be really nice. But of course he didn't fall for that and instead plays knight e2. But anyway, I felt like my position here must be pretty crushing. I'm now up a pawn after rook takes e4, and he played knight c1. And it just seems like black has a pawn and the initiative and very, very active pieces. Queen b5. So I'm hitting b2. He played knight to b3. And then I kind of slipped here with rook e2. This was really not a great move. I think I was just kind of hoping for queen a5 here, because then I'd have this simple trick with rook takes b3 and game over. But after his move knight to d4, it's suddenly not so easy to play black's position. I completely overlooked this move, and I'm lucky that I can still play for an advantage here. A number of ways actually, but yeah, it kind of disturbed me that I missed his reply. I think I was mostly expecting queen c1, and then I figured, well, his queen is passive, and I might have moves like rook to the second rank, maybe even a move like a5 is possible, and yeah, it just looked like everything is winning here for black. But I totally overlooked knight d4. And in my defense, Not really. He was already in very serious time trouble here. I mean, it's like move 24. We have to make it to move 40, and if I'm not mistaken, I feel like he was under 10 minutes at this point. So he was definitely in under pretty serious time pressure here. But okay, he played knight d4. Now I have to make a decision. In hindsight, maybe I should have just taken this queen and gone for the endgame with knight takes b5. Then let's say rook g2. Get a nice tempo on his bishop. I don't know where he plays, maybe bishop d2 or bishop c1. And then something like rook f7. He takes the a pawn and bishop e5. So I've temporarily given my extra pawn back, but I'm probably just going to win the h2 pawn, and these two connected passers on the king side are, offer really great winning chances. White's queenside pawns are very, very tough to move. So yeah, black is probably just cruising here and should win comfortably. Yeah, I feel like kind of regretful that I didn't go for that. Instead, I decided to take on d4. Queen takes d4 and knight g7. So I definitely understood that I'm now starting to take some risk because I've given up my dark square bishop, and white's dark square bishop has increased in value tremendously. And since I've already played g6, my dark squares are particularly weak. So I was definitely very concerned about just getting mated like bishop h6, rook f1, and things like that. With that in mind, I did feel like I have everything under control because my knight is coming to f5. And I'm going to be attacking this h6 square and gaining a tempo on his queen. And my rooks are very active and just kind of controlling all of the key lines here. So I think I am objectively doing quite well here with the extra pawn. But with that said, it's still not easy. So he pushes h4. I think this is the right idea. Just try to open lines and see what he can get. I play queen b6, queen g4, and rook f2. And he has this check with queen c8, but I calculated everything is just under control with rook e8. In fact, I saw I was even winning another pawn here. So queen d7, queen c5, and this is kind of the point. I'm hitting the c2 pawn, and he doesn't have a comfortable way to defend it, as I'm about to take on d5 as well. So bishop d2, I'll take on d5, or rook c1, I'll also just take that pawn. So bishop d2, I think I could have just taken on d5 right away, but of course, I wanted to be very careful of very potential tactics such as queen takes g7 check. This one looked scary. I don't think it works, and I think I realized it doesn't work during the game because white is going to have to give up his bishop for my queen anyway. I just have to find the key move here, queen e5, and looks like I'm just going to be in a rook endgame, 2 pawns up. So concretely, that doesn't work, but from a practical point of view, you never want to allow these kinds of chances unless you're 100% sure. But also, I had a simpler option here in rook f7, just getting this tempo first, kicking white's queen out of d7, covering the knight, and then after queen g4, now he definitely doesn't have any good discovery, so I figured it was very safe to take this pawn. And that was right, and now black is like 2 pawns up, so I feel like, and I felt like during the game I should win quite smoothly, but it's never easy. So bishop c3, I play queen f5. Any queen trade is going to be, I think, immediately decisive. Queen g2, I play queen f3, and he has to give more ground with queen g1 because of course he can't allow the trade. And then I decided to just push b6. Maybe in hindsight, a move like knight h5 here might be better, not even allowing him to play h5 and open the h-file. I don't think I'm really too disturbed by him grabbing this pawn. I'll probably just play b6 here. And then black is a very healthy pawn up. I can eventually round up the h4 pawn, but the important thing is things are under control and my king is not in danger. If he ever plays queen d4 here, I think I can usually meet that with rook e5. And yeah, everything is kind of covered. He definitely still has ideas here, but I think black is more or less okay. And should be doing well with the extra pawn. But okay, I played b6. I figured if he does play h5, I don't think he's getting much there, so I should be able to take it. And okay, he played h5. I grabbed it with knight takes h5 and queen g5. And now it's like white doesn't exactly have a threat, but he does want to continue building up, and you know, from black's point of view, if I want to win the game, I have to try and figure out how to squash the initiative. But it's not so easy, because he does want to play, let's say, rook g1, and then the knight on h5 will be hanging, and he does have ideas of like queen h6, and then maybe some sacrifices, on g6. So it's not that easy. He also has a lot of tricks in that position. For example, both queen f4 and queen f5 run into rook takes h5, and I'm just dropping a piece. So I definitely have to be very, very careful about that. I played rook e7. I figured this was a solid move, kind of overprotecting the 7th rank. He plays rook g1. And knight g7, this is already a pretty serious mistake. Actually, I would just call it a blunder. Somehow it slipped my mind that after knight g7, I'm no longer defending the h7 pawn here, and after queen h6, if I move my knight again, as was the plan with like knight f5 here, or maybe knight e6, then white has rook takes g6, and it's a pretty simple mate in 2, and game over. So instead of knight g7, I was analyzing a couple things here. The engine gives 2 moves, knight f4 and king f8. Knight f4 is very scary. The idea is that we're now defending g6, so after queen h6, black can just ignore it because white has no threat here. But yeah, it was a little bit... I didn't like the looks of this move during the game, because I figured maybe white has like rook f1, and I didn't really want to allow this tempo. I was very happy that this whole time rook f1 was never possible, since I could always just take on f1. But the easier move here to win, the one I really should have found, is king f8. And this is a very common defensive idea. You just like slide your king over to a safer side of the board. Because if my king gets to, let's say, the b7 square, and I put my queen on a light square, you know, I'm just completely safe here. White's dark square bishop can't do anything to the queenside structure. So this plan was available to me, and I mean, it looks a little bit scary, like queen h6 check, king e8, but in reality, white has nothing they can really do here. Black is just controlling everything and is 3 pawns up. So yeah, it was a bit unfortunate not to find that one. Okay, so I played knight g7, queen h6. Now, at this point, my opponent has been playing on the increment for a while, so I was definitely annoyed that he's coming up with like all the best moves, like most challenging moves in the position. And at this point, I had already run my clock down as well, so we're like move 38, and I only had a few minutes left here, so I figured I was in huge trouble. It felt very, very stressful, mainly because I just didn't see how I'm going to defend the h7 pawn. I ended up playing king to f8. I think this was the best move given the circumstances, but it actually allows white to win a piece. He missed it. Actually, during the game, I didn't even see this was possible either, because I was just focusing on not getting mated. But apparently bishop takes g7 was just winning the knight, because black cannot play rook takes g7 in view of rook f1 winning the queen. So I would be forced to play king to e8, and now white has an extra bishop for 3 pawns. He can play something like rook e1, and I think the engine here finds a pretty narrow path to an advantage for white. Maybe even like a decisive advantage. Something like this. I mean, we have 3 pawns for the piece, but white's bishop is clearly just a very, very strong piece. My king is not really yet safe, and it's going to be so hard to push these kingside pawns that I think in a practical game, white has very, very good winning chances here, in my opinion. Okay, so yeah, that was just a miss by both players. He went with the more obvious queen takes h7, which I was kind of expecting. Now he's starting queen h8 checkmate, so I slide over with king e8. I am happy I at least found the idea one move too late, but black is now surviving and can still count on at least 1 extra pawn. So queen takes g6 and knight e6, and I'm very fortunate that I have a nice trick here, because we've now reached the time control move 40. We got additional time here, and the point is now when white plays rook f1, which at first glance looks very strong. My rook here is pinned, so I can't take on f1. He'll just recapture. So if I have to move my queen here with like queen d5 or something, then I think white is probably just winning immediately with not rook h8 check, but maybe just taking on f7. I really should have checked this with the engine before the game. Actually, taking on f7. Yeah, this is kind of a funny line, and I can't take on h1 with check because of rook f1 counter check, and white wins. So I would be forced to take on f7 here, then probably rook f1, and okay, maybe black is actually still holding here with like knight d8. So I'll have to check what the engine says later, but maybe actually I might even be surviving after queen d5. In any case, it's kind of irrelevant because black has a better defensive move here. Probably a good time for an exercise, so if you guys want to pause the video and try to figure out what's the best move here for black to hold the position. Okay, and that move was knight to f8. So a really nice idea. I was definitely lucky to have this because I didn't want to go into those lines with queen d5. But the point is now I have a very nasty counterattack against white's queen. And if the queen moves away and doesn't pin the rook any longer, then of course I'm just going to take on f1. So this is unfortunate for white because now he's kind of committed to a queen trade. And fortunately for me, white doesn't have any kind of good desperados. Like he can play queen takes f7 check, but then I can take either with the rook or probably just easier take with the queen. And eventually we're going to reach this endgame where black is just going to have a very healthy pawn up. So after knight f8, he ends up just taking on f3 right away, which leads to virtually the same endgame. I don't think he had a choice other than to go for some kind of position like this. And he decides to trade rooks here. So now we've kind of reached like a completely different position. At first I was very frustrated that I wasn't able to convert earlier when I was like 3 pawns up. Then I was very relieved that I didn't just get mated or like lose a rook or something towards the end of the time control. And we finally found ourselves in this position where I was really very happy to have reached something stable, like just clear advantage, extra pawn in the endgame. All my pieces are, you know, coordinated and I have no weaknesses. So I felt like I could just milk this for like another 50 maybe more moves. Just very, very slowly, you know, put the king on a light square, bring the knight to e6, then push c5, d5, d4, bring the king in, and just very, very gently and slowly advance my position, and eventually look for some kind of breakthrough. I have no idea still whether black has serious winning chances or not. I feel like with best play, it should be drawn. I was analyzing a little bit. I think the key here is that if white is able to trade off a pair of pieces, whether it's the rooks or bishop for knight, then they're going to reach a drawn endgame that's pretty holdable. Yeah, like if we trade rooks here, for example, which I did not want to do during the game because I figure I should keep more pieces on if I'm trying to win. I think the problem here is that white just keeps his structure super stable with like b3, a4. The only way black can make progress is by trading off pawns, and eventually I'm just going to be left with like one passed pawn. He can sack his bishop for it and make an easy draw. So from my experience, what I've seen in these endgames, it's very difficult to win with an extra pawn, whether you have knight versus bishop or bishop versus knight. Though of course the specifics can really vary based on the pawn structure. So don't take that at 100% value. That said, an important point here is like whether it's winning or drawn, you know, what matters is that black will have chances here. So, you know, you just play, you try to pose problems for your opponent and, you know, try to exploit any mistakes that they make, which even very strong players will do when they're defending kind of unpleasant endgames. In any case, we'll take a look at the game. I didn't get many chances to really press. As we'll see, I kind of slipped up and allowed a forced drawing continuation. But let's take a look at what happened. So king d7, rook h5, king c6, rook h2, knight d5, bishop d2. I went back, king d7, rook h5, c6. He went back and I pushed c5. So now I want to play king c6, then bring my knight to e6, and then push d5, d4, and kind of just get this maximum space. He played king b2, king c6, bishop e1, and knight c7. This was kind of I think, a slightly careless move because I didn't realize that his idea was to play rook h6 and bishop g3, which is a very natural idea from white's point of view. So I really should have spent more time here. And had I done that, I would have just played a safe move like rook f6. So I cover the 6th rank. I don't let his rook get active there. If he plays rook h7, I'll probably just play a6. And it's pretty safe here because rook a7 is always met with knight c7 and his rook kind of gets trapped. So yeah, this was better, and then had I played this move, the game would have just continued, and I think it would have been like 50-50. I was analyzing some lines here. I think black can definitely create chances, and of course the most chances we can create is if I'm able to keep both the rook and the knight. So I was looking at some line here with a6, bishop e1, knight d5, and then a potential plan is to actually play b5, allow white to trade. Now white can make some moves here with like c3 and maybe keep some drawing chances. I'm not really sure. I mostly just wanted to see how does black win if white just does absolutely nothing to the pawns, you know, just keeps it as solid as possible. How is black going to break through? Because of course what often happens in these types of positions is that the defending side will make some kind of weakening move and then kind of make it easy for the opponent, or in some cases the engine finds some, you know, miracle fortress position that somehow you can't break through. But I really just want to know, like, what happens if white does nothing? Does black have a way to win here? And then, yeah, there's this plan to just put the pawn on b4. I figure white just keeps passing, rook f3, rook h6, let's say, and knight c3. And I think this is pretty close to winning, because white cannot really take on c3 here. I'll take with the pawn, and white is going to have issues with the c2 pawn. In fact, just can't defend it, like king b1. I give check and the rook comes to c1. Pretty typical motif. Then white probably plays rook h2 because what else? But now his king is like totally stuck. Can't go to a3 because there'll be rook a1 mate. And I think black just wins straightforward. Probably just running the pawns up the board, king d5. Eventually I'm guessing the break d3, king d4, king takes d3 should be winning. Just the c pawn will be way too strong, and white's king here is just really misplaced. Actually, now that I'm looking at it, a much simpler plan is to just play rook d1 and then rook to d2 and just take the pawn immediately. Probably don't even need to bring in the king. So since this endgame is kind of winning, white has to tolerate this knight on c3 and has to just try and hold the position. And I'm not sure exactly how black wins from here, but it does look like we get really nice chances, because maybe I'll play knight e4, eventually try to get d5, d4 in, and then the knight will come back to c3 with both pawns subboarding, and I'm going to try to play rook f1, rook b1 mate, just for example. So yeah, no guarantees that, of course, I would have actually won the game had I found all this. This is obviously just engine assisted analysis, but it is interesting to see how black can make progress and pose some problems. And that is a good technique whenever you're analyzing with the engine. If you're not sure how to win the position, just take the defending side and play against the engine and see how it beats you, and that's usually pretty instructive. Okay, so let's see what actually happened. I ended up playing knight c7, allowing rook h6, rook e7, bishop g3. And now, since I don't want to play rook e6 here and allow white to trade rooks, I'm kind of forced to play knight e6, and this is now awkward to unravel, because I have to keep defending the knight, but if the knight moves, then the d pawn is hanging. Maybe I can play d5 here, but I don't want to do that too early, because it feels like white is just going to have some weaknesses to attack. In any case, he plays bishop h4 here. He continues to pose problems. Rook e8. Rook h7. I played knight c7, though I really should have played a6, but okay. I didn't want to commit to a6 yet, so I tried to just play with the knight. Bishop g3, rook e6, bishop h4, and here I actually end up blundering with this move a6. So what I should have done is a move like rook e2, and then I think I can continue to unravel at least slowly. Next I'll play at some point a6, then knight e6, and yeah, maybe even get d5, d4 in, or look for ideas to play knight d4 and just target the c2 pawn. So probably black still has decent chances here. This move a6 was really a howler, because after white plays bishop d8, I saw this coming. I figured I would have a move here like knight d5, but it really runs into a nice trick with c4. And now if I move my knight, I'm just getting mated on c7. So black is just losing a piece here. Being kind of shocked by that after bishop d8, I really went into a deep think here. And I realized at this point that it's actually too late, and white is just getting enough counterplay with the rook coming to a7. So at this point, white has enough for a draw. I played knight e8, rook a7, and I just have no ways of keeping my extra pawn here. After a5, he played rook a6, and just to point out, he's actually not even threatening to take the pawn right away. If I play the move d5, because after rook takes a6, king b7, the rook actually ends up being trapped and the b6 pawn is now defended. But white's idea is to just play a5 here. And now my queenside is just collapsing. So if I take, he takes here, and then he'll take the second pawn and just equalize immediately. Or like king d7, for example, trades rooks, takes on a5, and is a draw. So yeah, having realized now I no longer have any chances, I pushed a5. He played rook a6, knight c7. Now, of course, I would love it for him to take, so I could at least play a rook endgame with an extra pawn, but instead he has rook a7, and because of the same trick, after knight d5, c4, I don't really have a way to play for a win here with black. So I play knight e8, rook a6, knight c7, and we repeated moves and agreed to a draw. Looking at the game, I did have one last chance after bishop d8 to at least try to trick him with this move knight to a8 instead of knight e8. I didn't really consider this move during the game because it just looks terrible. Like, why would you ever put the knight on a8? But it does set a nice trap. So if white plays the move rook a7 here, which seems like the most natural move and actually seems like a winning move, black actually gets the upper hand with this move rook e8. And now the point is pretty clear. If white takes on a8, I'll play king to b7, and the rook is trapped, and black is winning the exchange here eventually. But after knight a8, of course, it's like very unlikely that this would happen on the board. I mean, in a bullet game, sure. Like rook a7 just seems like the most obvious move, and a lot of players would just play it instantly. But in a tournament game, he had time on his clock. He would obviously understand that knight a8 looks like a blunder, and he would for sure calculate what my idea is before playing rook a7. And yeah, after rook a7, it's like, what other move does black even have other than something like rook e8? So yeah, actually technically he's not even threatening to take the knight in that position because I'll play king b7, but rook e8 is the only move that actually punishes white. If I had played a different move here, then he can just get out with his rook or move his bishop. Rook e8 attacks the bishop and defends the knight, so the point is now when the bishop moves back, I play knight c7, and this actually traps his rook. And so he has big problems here. From here, the winning plan is just like c4, b5, and then king b6, and the rook is lost. But yeah, I feel like if I play knight a8, it's very unlikely that he actually falls for it. More likely he plays the better move a5. The point being now, if I push b5, he will go rook a7 and then take the a6 pawn with check. And this is, I think, much different if I'm not miscalculating here. And if I take on a5, then again rook a7 or bishop takes a5, and I think white is just completely fine here because this knight is just horribly misplaced. So that was one like micro chance, but I doubt it would have amounted to anything during the game. So yeah, after this game, I was definitely feeling pretty disappointed. For one, just like blowing a huge advantage with like 3 extra pawns, and this terrible move I made with knight g7 and allowing queen h6 and just giving white all of a sudden a huge attack. And then I was disappointed that I wasn't really able to pose that many problems in the endgame. He kind of just found this counterplay with bringing the rook and bishop actively, and I wasn't really able to unravel and get anything going. So that was kind of a bummer as well. But what to do? So that game was drawn. In round 9, I was paired with my friend Tadev Abrahamian, and I don't think I'm going to do a whole video on that game. It was basically 10 moves in a Nimzo. I offered a draw, which was accepted, and and that was that. So pretty short game. We both kind of wanted to end our tournament at that point. So yeah, I ended up with 4.5 out of 9. Definitely not my best result. Definitely a pretty bad result, but the games were quite interesting, and there was a lot of misses and a lot of interesting ideas. So I feel like I learned quite a bit from this tournament, and hopefully I can use this in future games and events as well. All right, with that, I'll be signing off. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care.